Hi everyone, welcome back. My name's Morgan. This is my channel, Pisces Paperbacks, and today I want to talk about my least favorite books of the year. Overall, I feel like I had a really good reading year. Generally, I read a lot of books that I loved, but I also read quite a few that I was not as much a fan of. Hi, baby! And those are the books I want to talk about right now. These actually aren't the 5 books that I ranked 1 star this year. The 2 that I'm not going to talk about are Tangled Threat by Heather Graham and Ink by Alice Broadway. These are books that I thought were objectively bad, but honestly, I have not enough feelings about them to talk about. So those were 1-star books, but these are the 5 that I feel elicited the biggest negative emotional reaction over the course of 2019. Also, these are in chronological order, so I'm not actually ranking them, but I will let you know what I rated these books. The first book I want to talk about is The Virgin's Lover by Phillipa Gregory. This was actually the 2nd or 3rd book I read this year, and I hated it. The characters were infuriating, and there wasn't really a plot. The plot that is kind of pitched on the back cover doesn't happen until about 50 pages from the end of the book, or less than 100 pages from the end of the book for sure. So it was just really frustrating reading this, knowing that I hated the characters and that it wasn't actually telling me, like a lot of the other I've read a couple other Phillipa Gregory books and I really loved them. For example, The Other Bowling Girl and The Queen's Fool. I loved those books. I read them a while ago, so maybe that was it. But this one didn't teach me anything, and I hated it, and specifically the characterization of Queen Elizabeth I. She is depicted as this hand-wringing, whining, completely unable to make her own decisions, like beholden to all the men in her life, dependent in every way, just flighty, over-emotional, and just honestly really annoying to read about. And maybe she was like that in real life. I mean, obviously nobody alive ever met Queen Elizabeth I, and maybe there's writings about her that describe her in certain negative ways, but honestly, this is a fiction. This is historical fiction that's based on history, so you can take liberties and make her less freaking annoying. So I just hated the experience of reading this book. I was muttering angrily to myself the whole time, and I gave it 1 star. Up next is Let's Talk About Love by Kann. I actually read this book for my LGBTQ novels class that I took last semester, and I gave it 2 stars only because the asexuality representation in this book was actually really, really good. The main character in this book, I forget her name, but she is a young black woman she's like 19, and she is asexual, and this book isn't really about her embracing her sexuality. It's about her, or discovering her sexuality. It's about her really embracing it and learning to love who she is. And honestly, this book was it had no depth. I felt like all of the relationships were very rushed, and there were 2 characters. There's supposed to be 4 characters, but there's really only 2 that are really developed, but one of them was just kind of thrown in as a love interest, and I thought the plot of her trying to figure out what her career that she wanted to pursue was going to be. The whole book she talks about how she loves aesthetics and now her only hobby is watching Netflix, and I was like, okay, she's going to go into filmmaking, cinematography, some sort of photography, something like that. She decides to go into interior decorating, which comes out of nowhere, and honestly, this book was just a pain to read because it was so surface level and not particularly well written. So that was a 2-star book, but only because I don't think it was hurtful in any way and the representation was good, whereas the book by itself, I just didn't enjoy it all. Next is the All Souls trilogy by Deborah Harkness. The first is A Discovery of Witches, the second is Shadow of Night, and the 3rd book is called The Book of Life. The first book I actually quite enjoyed. I think I gave it 3.5 stars. It was an interesting premise about a girl who's trying not to be a witch, discovers this enchanted book in a library at Oxford and falls in love with a vampire, which is also a trend from this year. I read a lot of vampire books, but honestly, the 2nd book in this series is 500 and something pages. It is completely boring and stupid, and I hated it. And okay, it's not stupid, and obviously if you like these books, we all have our own opinions, and those opinions are all valid for different reasons, you know what I mean? But I just hated Shadow of Night so much. It was very episodic, so it would be like nothing happening, nothing happening, nothing happening, something happening, nothing happening, nothing, and it was just like, but not even in a way that was building up to anything. The level of energy would go up at each activity and then go even lower the next time. And it was just very frustrating to read. The third book did a fine job wrapping up the series, but nothing to write home about and almost completely forgettable as soon as I finished. So this series overall was just not a win for me. This one was 3 stars. Shadow of Night, the second book, I gave 1 star, and then the last book, I believe I gave 2 stars. Just kidding, I checked and I gave A Discovery of Witches 4 stars, so I must have really enjoyed this book, but the rest of the series kind of ruined it for me. Next, I want to talk about The Woman in the Window by A.J. Finn, and this is actually the only book I DNF'd this entire year. What are you doing? So, The Woman in the Window is about a woman who is agoraphobic, and so she can't leave her house, and she like spies on all her neighbors, and she believes that she sees a crime in the house of one of her neighbors. And the reason I didn't like this book is because the entire thing is that hysterical woman trying to convince everybody that she's not crazy trope, and that is like my least favorite thing. I find it extremely frustrating and dismissive and degrading, and I am a person who, like, I can appreciate an unreliable narrator, definitely, but I like to believe in my narrators. I like to believe in my main characters and, like, trust them as people. So it's just very, very frustrating to me when the entire plot, like, device of a book is that nobody believes the main character. It can be done in good ways. I feel like when the character in question who's like trying to convince people is like, okay, I clearly have to prove it, so I'm gonna like do some investigating. But because she can't leave her house, she just like self-medicates the whole book, and it's just very frustrating to me. I stopped at about the 70% mark during the audiobook and looked up the spoilers for the end so I would know what if I was missing anything, and I didn't think the twists were that crazy. I wasn't really surprised when I figured out or when I read what actually happened. So I gave this book, I gave it 2 stars because the writing was perfectly fine and it's like a me thing that I didn't like it, but I did DNF it, so maybe I should give it like 1 star. I don't know, I'll think about that, but for now, it is at 2 stars. Lastly, I want to talk about Someone to Watch Over Me by Lisa Kleypas. This is actually the only romance novel on this list, and the reason that I disliked this one so much is basically because of the hero. This book deals with sex work, kind of. So it's a historical romance where a Bow Street runner, or like fancy police officer from old-timey London, finds a woman who has been attacked, and he recognizes her as a courtesan, or basically like a high-class escort who will have affairs with men or men of society in exchange for money and protection. And he is like, oh, she has no memory, I'll take her back to my house and like try to find out who attacked her, but also this girl rejected me a while ago, and so I'm just gonna kind of like trick her into thinking that we were lovers and then make fun of her when, like, not actually give her protection when she remembers who she is. First of all, premise, already hate him. The problem is when this woman like regains consciousness and starts interacting, and he realizes that she doesn't remember anything, but she's also acting nothing like the kind of vain woman he thought she was supposed to be. The entire book is just a monologue of him going, she's so sweet and kind, but is she just pretending? Because clearly she's a slut, and that means she's a bad person. Like, why isn't she acting all vain? Like, she has sex with other men, and she's beautiful and can read. This is shocking to me. And just basically the crux of the entire book is basically him convincing himself that, like, women having sexual freedom is bad, and people or women who do have sex with men like are bad, but they do it in the first place because they were bad already. And this was just like a visceral anger the entire book. I was just not having it. I gave that book 1 star. So those are all 5 of the worst books I read this year. And before I go, I do want to drop in 2 of the most disappointing books that I read this year. So books that I didn't think were particularly bad, but just weren't to my taste, and I had really been excited for them. And those were The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. I know that this is like a very popular booktube book, and I was very disappointed to say that I didn't really like it. I thought it moved extremely slowly. It didn't explain the rules of the world in any way I found very satisfying, and I thought that the kind of pieced together multiple timelines kind of plot, it just, in this case, it didn't particularly work for me. I think because each chapter brought so little new to the plot instead of really adding something each time. I don't know, it's just not my cup of tea, although I do think I want to read Erin Morgenstern's new book, The Starless Sea, but I don't know, we shall see. The other book I want to talk about is Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children by Ransom Riggs. I read this entire series this year. They were some of the first audiobooks I listened to, and the audiobooks themselves were perfectly fine. But I just was disappointed overall by these books. They were just very dry, and I hated the second book in this series, which I think was called Hollow World. Nope. Something of Days. Honestly, I don't remember, and I don't want to remember, but this was just kind of a disappointing series for me. It was cool, like the peculiarities, but the personalities of all the children were like really annoying, and I just wanted a little bit more explanation as to how peculiarities work. And I know that they're not supposed to have explanations. Like, that's the whole point. Marcy, what are you doing? But I needed a little explanation as to how an umbrella like peculiar can apply to both a very strong girl and a guy who lets bees live in his body. You know what I mean? Like, where do those connect? Where do they connect? Anyway, I was just not a fan of those, and these were all the books that I really just didn't particularly like this year, which is pretty good, to be honest. Like, I feel like I had a pretty good year, so I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you like any of these books or if you agree with me on my thoughts for any of these books, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!